He was trained to stand still, to remain silent no matter the chaos. But when a blind man stumbled near the palace gates, confused, disoriented, and one step away from danger, one royal guard did the unthinkable. He moved. The man had been circling slowly, tapping his cane along the stone, muttering softly to himself, "I just need to find the bus." Tourists watched, some filming, some smirking, none stepping forward. He bumped into a barrier, turned again, and inched closer to the edge of the pavement. That's when it happened. From across the courtyard, a single guard broke rank. No shout, no ceremony, just a silent step down, boots landing with purpose, rifle lowered. In an instant, centuries of tradition shattered, not with words, but with a gesture that spoke louder than any command. Before we show you what happened next, hit that subscribe button and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Harold Avery had never been the kind of man who asked for help. At 72, he still carried himself with quiet pride, the kind of dignity that came not from wealth or status, but from years of honest work. For most of his life, Harold had been a piano tuner, the kind who didn't just adjust keys but could feel an entire room's emotion in the hum of a string. His ears had always been sharper than most men's eyes, and that had served him well, until his own vision began to fade. He started losing his sight in his early 60s. At first, it was manageable, just a little blur, a little more light needed. But by 67, it was gone. His wife, Margaret, became his anchor during those years. She read to him, walked with him, laughed when he bumped into furniture and pretended it was a secret game they shared. They had planned to return to London together one day, to the city where they'd shared their honeymoon, where she'd taken him to see the gates of Buckingham Palace for the first time. But Margaret passed away 2 years ago. A quiet illness, a slow goodbye, and now Harold had come alone, not for closure, but to honor a promise, to stand once more where she had held his hand in front of the palace. He didn't want attention. He didn't want pity. He just wanted to find the memory, feel the moment, and make it back to his hotel in time for tea. But the world had changed since then. The crowds were louder, the layout unfamiliar. The noise disoriented him. He couldn't hear the space like he used to. And in the middle of the swirling confusion, Harold realized he was lost, utterly, completely lost. Still, he didn't panic. He didn't cry out. He simply straightened his coat, steadied his grip on the cane, and told himself, as Margaret would have, just ask your feet to remember, one step at a time. But the feet didn't remember, and the crowd didn't care, until one silent man did. Corporal James Rowe had earned a reputation inside the guard for one thing: stillness. He didn't blink at tourists who barked in his face. He didn't flinch when children waved, when phones flashed inches from his eyes, or even when protesters screamed inches away. His composure was legendary, cold, some called it. Untouchable. That didn't bother James. Stillness was his armor, and it had been built not just by training, but by memory. At 35, James had been in uniform for over a decade. But before the Queen's Guard, before the rifle and the ceremony, there was a boy holding the hand of a man with no sight. His father, Alan Rowe, had gone blind when James was just 10. It started slowly, just night blindness, they thought. But within a year, it had stolen everything. What it couldn't take, though, was dignity. Alan never let his blindness define him. He still walked James to school, still shaved himself, still taught his son how to play chess, read maps by memory, and, most importantly, how to listen. Alan used to say, "Help shouldn't feel like a rescue. It should feel like a whisper. Guide quietly, son. James never forgot that. Now, as a royal guard, James often thought of his father when he stood at attention, how stillness had meant safety for Alan, how quiet presence could calm fear. He didn't just guard the palace. He guarded the invisible lines of dignity people carried with them, whether they were royals or strangers passing by. So when he saw the man, cane, tapping stone, turning slowly in circles, shoulders folding inward with quiet confusion, James noticed. Even from across the courtyard, even with his eyes locked straight ahead, he noticed. It was subtle. Most people didn't catch it. But to James, it was as loud as a shout. The man's head tilted slightly as he strained to hear something familiar. He turned the wrong way, bumped into the edge of the barrier, and then he stood frozen, lips moving faintly. I just need to find the bus. No one helped. Some watched. One laughed. James's hand twitched near his rifle. He knew the rule, never move. But something deeper stirred inside him, older than training, older than protocol. It was his father's voice, guide quietly, and in that moment, James Rowe didn't flinch. He stepped. The chaos built slowly, so subtly that most people didn't notice it until it was nearly too late. Harold, still trying to orient himself, tapped his cane toward what he thought was a curb leading to a safe walkway. But in the swirl of sound, tourist chatter, honking horns, distant footsteps, his internal compass misfired. The direction he took was not toward safety, but toward the palace drop-off lane where a red tour bus was just beginning to round the bend. The screech of tires hit the air like a warning bell. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Stop him!" And then Corporal James Rowe did the unthinkable. Without hesitation, he moved. It wasn't a leap or a panic-driven sprint. It was precise, composed, and deeply intentional. He stepped down from his platform, his polished boot striking the pavement with the weight of history, and lowered his rifle with calm care. The crowd watched in collective disbelief as the man who was trained never to react walked directly toward Harold, breaking the sacred stillness the Queen's Guard is known for. With eyes locked on the elderly man, James closed the distance between them. No spectacle, no command, just presence. When he reached Harold, he didn't shout or grab. Instead, he gently placed a firm hand on Harold's shoulder, grounding him in the noise. "May I guide you, sir?" he asked, voice calm and steady. Harold froze, surprised by the nearness of someone who hadn't spoken until now. He turned his head slightly toward the sound, reading James's voice more than his words. Then, with the dignity of someone who'd spent years accepting the wrong kind of help, he quietly answered, "Yes, thank you." Silence held for a moment longer. Then the crowd began to clap, softly at first, then growing louder, not in frenzy but in admiration. Some recorded. Others simply watched. A child whispered to her father, "He saved him." James didn't respond. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply did what needed to be done. In that moment, he wasn't just a soldier breaking formation. He was a man honoring something far older than any tradition. The simple, silent act of stepping up when no one else would. James didn't let go of Harold's arm until they reached the edge of the plaza, where a quiet bench sat tucked beneath the shade of a tree. The chaos of the palace courtyard softened behind them. Footsteps faded, murmurs grew distant, and the pulse of traffic dulled to a hum. It was only then that James gently eased Harold down onto the bench, his movements deliberate and respectful, the way you'd guide someone not just with hands, but with care. He said nothing at first. He didn't need to. James stood for a moment, as if unsure whether to return to post or remain. Then, slowly, still in full ceremonial uniform, he sat beside Harold, rifle resting across his knees, posture perfect, but his presence somehow softer now. The two men sat in silence, not awkward, but weighty, like two pages folded shut on different stories that suddenly shared the same paragraph. Harold let out a breath. "My wife used to bring me here," he said quietly. "She always said the gates were more beautiful than the crown jewels. She'd squeeze my hand every time we stood here, just like the day she married me." James said nothing. He just listened. "She passed last spring." Harold continued. "Cancer, quick, quiet. She'd have hated the fuss people make when they die. That's why I came today. I needed to remember what it felt like to be beside her, even if I can't see the gates anymore." The silence returned, this time deeper, more reverent. James didn't respond with platitudes. He didn't offer sympathy laced in ceremony. He simply sat, still, alert, respectful. A soldier beside a stranger. Two men mourning something unseen. For all the tourists who came to see the royal guards as statues, this was a moment they would have never imagined. A man in full dress uniform, medals gleaming in the filtered sun, sitting shoulder to shoulder with an old blind widower. No commands needed. James didn't know Harold's wife. He hadn't known his story until minutes ago. But he understood the weight of carrying memory. And in that quiet, he gave Harold exactly what he came for. Not pity, not rescue, but presence. And in return, Harold gave him something too. A reminder that sometimes the most human thing a guard can do is simply sit still in the right place. James was only 9 the first time his father handed him the cane and said, "Let's try it your way." It was a quiet summer evening in their small village, the kind where bird song carried across cobblestone streets and everything smelled like fresh grass and wood smoke. Alan Rowe had gone blind 2 years earlier, retinitis pigmentosa, the doctors said, but he never let it stop him. He still insisted on his evening walks, still shaved without help, still taught James to tie knots and crack jokes without ever seeing the punchline land. That night, James took his father's hand and led him gently down their narrow lane. Their roles reversed without ceremony. No announcement, just movement. "Don't tug, son," his father had said with a smile, tapping the pavement gently. Help should never feel like charity, just direction. James never forgot those words. He remembered how his father never let his blindness become a spectacle, how he despised people speaking to him in slow, loud voices, how he'd whisper to James, "They mean well, but don't let them teach you that kindness needs to be loud. True help is subtle." Years later, as James trained with the Royal Guard, those memories surfaced often. The precision, the silence, the control. In some ways, his father had been preparing him for this life long before he ever touched a rifle. And today, as he sat on that bench beside Harold, another blind man with the same quiet dignity, those memories came rushing back. The grip of his father's hand, the way he used to smile every time James described the sunset to him like it was a painting, the way he listened, not to be pitied, but to stay connected. It wasn't just protocol that made James hesitate before moving from his post. It was legacy. But when Harold stepped too close to danger, when no one else moved and the world turned to silence, those childhood instincts overrode everything. Because James didn't see a stranger. He saw a man his father could have been. And he remembered that guiding someone wasn't about stepping in with drama, it was about stepping forward with grace. Just direction. Nothing more, nothing less. By evening, The photos had already started making their way across the internet. Not taken by professionals, not filtered or staged, just ordinary people capturing an extraordinary moment. One image in particular seemed to ripple through every feed. Corporal James Rowe, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, walking slowly across the palace courtyard, hand gently guiding an elderly blind man. Their hands weren't tightly clasped, just lightly connected, like two pages of the same story. There was no outrage, no backlash, just awe. The image went viral for all the right reasons. News outlets picked it up within hours. Headlines didn't scream scandal. They whispered admiration. A guard breaks formation and reveals the soul of his uniform. Stillness redefined, the guard who stepped forward. On Twitter, someone posted the photo with the caption, "He didn't just help him, he honored him." Within minutes, the hashtag #Silent Guide began trending. People from all over the world chimed in, not with criticism, but with stories. Sons who once guided fathers, nurses who understood quiet dignity, veterans who remembered what it felt like to be seen, not managed. But one comment stood out. It came from an account named Avery Lilly, Harold's granddaughter. Her words were raw, written in the emotional immediacy of someone who had just seen something sacred go public. "That's my granddad. His name is Harold. He lost his wife, lost his sight, but not his courage. Today, he got lost at the palace trying to remember her, and this guard, this beautiful soul, didn't just help him back. He gave him the moment he came for. Thank you, whoever you are." The tweet was simple, unpolished, but it hit like a drumbeat. Underneath it, thousands of comments poured in. People posted their own family memories. A blind woman from Canada wrote, "He made me feel seen through a screen." Another user added, "I used to laugh at the guards for standing so still. Now, I'll never see them the same again." No press conference was called. No palace statement issued. But something subtle shifted in the public consciousness. In a time where outrage so often drowns out compassion, the world had stopped for a quiet moment and listened, not to a scandal, not to a soundbite, but to a single, silent act of honor between two strangers. And in that quiet space, the dignity of both men, one who could no longer see and one who chose to truly see him, lit up something rare. Respect without noise, grace without permission, just presence, and the courage to reach for someone in the simplest way. 3 days after the moment that quietly moved millions, Corporal James Rowe was summoned. Not in front of flashing cameras, not through public ceremony, but with a sealed envelope, hand-delivered to his commanding officer. The message was simple. Report to the East Wing at 0900 hours. Dress uniform. James arrived early, polished to regulation, face composed. He wasn't sure what to expect. Technically, he had broken protocol. Guards do not abandon post, no matter the circumstance. He had stepped forward, touched a civilian, spoken out loud, all violations of centuries-old standards. But he didn't regret a single movement. He was led into a small private chamber near the royal residence, where 2 senior aides stood waiting beside a mahogany desk. They didn't speak at first. One simply handed him a parchment envelope, wax sealed with the prince's insignia. Inside was a handwritten note. "Corporal Rowe, stillness is powerful, but sometimes movement shows the greater strength. In choosing humanity over ceremony, you honored this uniform in the truest sense. You reminded the world that our presence is not only for display, it is for service. Thank you for leading without command, for guiding without fanfare, and for breaking the silence in exactly the right way. Silent action is still leadership. William. James lowered the letter slowly, absorbing every word. There was no reprimand, no audit. Just quiet gratitude and something even rarer in the military world. Trust. He wasn't reassigned to desk duty. He wasn't warned. Instead, he was promoted, quietly, to serve on the ceremonial escort unit for royal veterans. It was an elite detail, one reserved for those with both discipline and heart. A posting that blended the poise of tradition with the soul of remembrance. As James exited the chamber, he didn't puff his chest or quicken his step. He walked as he always did, precise, upright, composed. But inside something was lighter, because now his stillness carried more than duty. It carried the knowledge that in one step, just one, he had shown the world what the uniform truly meant. Weeks had passed since the moment that quietly rippled across the world, but for Corporal James Rowe, the memory hadn't faded. The crowds at the palace had returned to their usual rhythm. The protocol remained unchanged, and yet something about his posture felt different now, less about rigidity, more about meaning. One morning, a small padded envelope arrived at the barracks addressed to him personally. Inside was a folded letter, its top sheet embossed in braille. Beneath it, a transcription, typed, neat and dated, was clipped gently with a paper clip. It began simply, "Dear James, you didn't speak loudly. You didn't make a scene. You just stood beside me. And that, my friend, is the kind of kindness we remember for the rest of our lives. I've spent years learning how to manage without my eyes, but I never wanted to learn how to move through the world unseen. That day, you didn't just guide me. You noticed me, quietly, respectfully, without turning me into a lesson or a burden. I can't tell you what that meant, but I'll try to show you." James turned the letter over and saw what had been tucked carefully into the fold, a small, worn piano key, drilled cleanly at one edge, threaded onto a simple leather cord. A key that had clearly seen decades of music. Beneath it, the letter concluded, "This was my favorite middle C, from the last piano I ever tuned. My hands can't use it anymore, but yours reminded me what dignity sounds like. Keep it. Play it differently." James closed the envelope slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't show it to anyone. He simply removed his glove, ran his fingers across the raised braille one more time, and slipped the piano key into the inside pocket of his uniform. A quiet thank you, a worn middle C. The kind of note that stays with you forever. The palace gates still gleam in the morning light. Tourists still gather, cameras poised, waiting to capture a guard who will never move, never blink. The routine continues. The precision, the poise, the ritual. But for those who witnessed that quiet moment weeks ago, those gates no longer just symbolize tradition. They represent something deeper now, something quieter. They represent compassion. Because while the guard returned to his post and the crowds went home, the echo of what happened that day remains, not in headlines, not in royal statements, but in the way people now look at the uniform, not just as a symbol of discipline, but as a reminder that real strength doesn't always come from stillness. Sometimes it takes just one step forward to redefine what honor truly looks like. Harold may have walked away unseen by most, but he was seen by the one person who mattered in that moment. And that was enough. Have you ever helped someone, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because you saw them? Would you have stepped forward like James, or stayed still like the rest of the world? Let us know in the comments below. Share this story with someone who believes true strength doesn't always march. It walks quietly beside those who need it. And we'll see you tomorrow with another Royal Guard story that speaks without sound and acts without applause.